So here's a scenario. You take your car to the DMV, they do an inspection and it doesn't pass. Should they haul it off to the junkyard to be used as scrap metal? No. They give you feedback as to exactly what the problem is, and you're expected to take that information and go and make improvements and come back. That's formative assessment in a nutshell. My research interest is to understand the effects of formative assessment on students. I'm particularly interested in using it in an online environment and how this impacts people who study mathematics. So why am I interested and what is the importance? Well, the first question we have to ask is if paying attention to the teacher's day-to-day classroom assessment will pay off. Well, Paul Black and Dylan Williams read 700 journal articles on assessment and narrowed that down to 250 as being relevant. Then they looked at a small number of really good research studies that gave the answer to this question, does it pay off? The answer, yes. Let's consider this scenario, which has been done by several researchers, always concluding with the same general findings. We start with a sample of students, break our sample into 3 groups. One group gets grades only, one group gets comments only, and one group is given grades and comments. Now the researchers were interested in learning gain and interest in the subject. These were the dependent variables. So what do you think they found? The group that was given grades only showed very little or no learning gain, and in interest some went up and some went down. The group that was given comments only showed substantial learning gain, and it had a large impact on improving their interest. The group that was given grades and comments showed very little learning gain, and in interest some went up and some went down. What we need to understand here is that an assessment is only formative if it's used to modify the teaching and learning process. So if we just use assessments to get information and then enter that information into our spreadsheets, that's not formative. For example, if a teacher gets the students' assignments and gives them all grades, that's not formative. And as I described, that's actually bad to do because kids don't do anything with it other than say, I did well, I did badly, and that's the end of it. Now contrast that with homework where the teacher writes a few comments and then expects the students to work on those comments to improve it. And then they look at those comments afterwards. That's formative. In this case, homework becomes a positive part of the learning process. Now when we look at a tight experimental control pre-post test model, most educational interventions don't work. They may sound good, they may give people the warm fuzzies, but they show little or no effect. Formative assessment is one of the few that has been proven to be effective, and best of all, it can be done at very little cost. So what kind of improvement can we expect? Well, if we take the average improvement score on tests and divide that by the average score for a typical group of students on that same test, we have an effect size. Formative assessment experiments produce typical effect sizes of between 0.4 and 0.7. This is huge, much larger than you would find in typical educational interventions. Let's start at the low end. Say we have an average student, Joe Snuffy, whose teacher starts using formative assessment. If our average student, Joe, has experiences on the low end of the effect size, 0.4, Joe would still end up in the top 35% of those not involved. Let's look at a 0.7 effect size. When they do these international comparisons between countries, the United States typically does poorly, especially in regards to mathematics. If formative assessment were used and we experienced a 0.7 effect size, we could expect to rise to one of the top 5 countries in the world. We know students who do well in school obtain higher levels of education and have a whole host of benefits, including making more money. It's been estimated that if students could have an improvement of 1 standard deviation in performance, the taxes on the extra revenue brought in from these students would pay entirely for the K-12 system within 30 years. So clearly we're playing for big stakes here. So the question I leave you with is, what would it take to convince you to start using formative assessment today? Thanks for your time.